In the heart of America's grasslands, a battle for survival is unfolding. The lesser prairie chicken, an iconic species of the Great Plains, is on the brink of extinction.
If you imagine Native Americans and European settlers traveling across the southwestern Great Plains through this endless sea of grass, feeding themselves on lesser prairie chickens, they never could have imagined the day that all that would be left is postage stamps of prairies in an endangered species. But that's where we are.
And yet there's a growing network of producers and partners across the plains looking to change that.
The only places they are left today are where these caring ranchers are stewarding the habitat and stewarding the landscape and stewarding these native prairies, keeping them there.
And today, we're going to meet a few of these stewards.
I think everybody that ranches knows that if done in the right way, if grazing is planned in the right way, that it is nothing but a benefit to the landscape.
I can't dictate what a chicken's going to do, but I can build them a home, and I can build a habitat, and I can make it, desirable for them to be there. I think if we would open our eyes as a society and look at who's going to be the one that's going to lead this ecological revolution, it's going to be the producer.
And in a landscape that is 90% privately owned, the conservation challenges we face today demand new solutions, like how do we fund this important stewardship?
And how do we work to recover a species while supporting the communities that are on the ground doing the work?
In this time when we're trying to address a lot of conservation problems across the country, that kind of innovation, I think, is where we need to go.
Welcome back to Working Wild U, a show about the people and wildlife of the American West, from the crossroads of culture and science.
I'm Hallie Mahold, Chief Programs Officer at Western Landowners Alliance. We are a network of landowners, managers, and partners dedicated to keeping the working lands of the American West whole and healthy for the benefit of both people and wildlife.
And I'm Jared Beaver, Assistant Professor and Extension Wildlife Specialist at Montana State University. My work focuses on identifying and improving conservation efforts in areas where people and wildlife share the landscape, a place many folks call the working wild.
Today on the show, can ranchers and partners work together to save the lesser prairie chicken while supporting their livelihoods and communities?
We're headed to eastern New Mexico to find out.
Our show continues after the break.
Working Wild U is a proud part of Natural Resources University, a podcast network delivering science-based information for your natural resource management. Other current network series include Timber University, Fish University, Deer University, Fire University, and Habitat University. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
The best-known conservation stories often involve a sudden and very visible threat to a species' survival. One of the most well-known examples is the case of the bald eagle and the widespread use of the pesticide DDT.
DDT, introduced in the 1940s, was used extensively in agriculture to control insects. However, its impact on wildlife, particularly birds of prey, soon became apparent.
DDT accumulated in the food chain, causing bald eagles and other birds to ingest high concentrations of the chemical. This led to reproductive problems, including thin eggshells, which often broke before hatching.
As a result, bald eagle populations plummeted, prompting a listing under the Endangered Species Preservation Act in 1967. This was a predecessor to the Endangered Species Act.
Soon after, DDT was banned by the Environmental Protection Agency. This ban, coupled with conservation efforts mandated by the Endangered Species Act, allowed bald eagle populations to make a remarkable recovery.
It's a textbook conservation success story with a beginning, middle, and end. It's simple. The cause, DDT, and the effect, thin eggshells. Easy for us to wrap our heads around.
But as we are discovering this season, what if the cause and effects impacting a species are less clear? What if there are 100 causes and 100 different effects? And what if the story is in slow motion, every day, happening right before our eyes?
That is the conservation challenge of our time. Not grabby headlines or juicy sound bites. No quick and simple solutions. Multifaceted problems often call for multifaceted solutions.
This is the story of the lesser prairie chicken. Bear with us, there are a lot of threads to this story. The approach to saving the bird is so holistic that at times it may be difficult to see just how everything connects back, but we will get there.
And be warned, you'll find no quick fixes or simple answers in today's episode. Instead, we'll witness the daily beat of collaborative conservation, the quiet, thankless work of building trust, building community, and building habitat.
This isn't the end of the story for the lesser prairie chicken. This is only the beginning. Before dawn on the high plains of eastern New Mexico, Megan Nasto, a research scientist with Working Lands Conservation, was on a mission.
And I really wanted to see a chicken.
We're talking about the lesser prairie chicken, a species of prairie grouse endemic to the southern and central plains of the United States.
So before even starting our 10-hour workday of collecting soil, we woke up at like 3 a.m. or 4 a.m., got in the truck, packed up, a thermos of coffee, and just went searching for leks.
Leks are areas where male birds congregate to attract and compete for females during mating season in the early spring.
We would just choose a dirt road, drive down the dirt road, and then stop, kill the engine, roll down the windows, and see if we could hear that characteristic booming sound that the chickens make in the morning. And of course, the first day we did this, we didn't hear anything. But I was determined, so that we went out the following morning and did the whole thing over again. And this time, we actually did hear the booming. Then we got out and we sort of crept as slowly as we could across the rangeland. We're trying to make as little noise as we possibly could. We didn't want to get too close that we were going to scare them off. We just sat right down in the grasses and we just kept listening. After 5 or 10 minutes of hearing their booming over and over again, we pulled out our binoculars, and that's when I actually got to see them for the first time. We would see the males sort of jump just above the height of the grasses and boom and come back down, and jump above and come back down, and jump above and come back down. It was so cool to finally see, because they're just these neat, beautiful little birds that are so important but so elusive. And it was in a pasture that had grazing too. So there was a lek there where cattle graze, and it helped me really connect to the importance of this project.
So we've talked a lot this season about the plight of our grasslands, the most imperiled ecosystem on the planet. And that slow motion decline of lesser prairie chickens, for the most part, it's driven by habitat loss.
This habitat loss originates from the patterns and policies of land settlement history in the United States. Think of the Homestead Act. As a result of that history, the plains are largely privately owned.
And we're not just plowing up the plains for farming. Development of homes and cities, oil and gas, and poor land management have contributed to the decline of America's grassland biome, down to just 40% of what we had a century ago. And much of that remaining grassland is fragmented.
In essence, we humans derive a lot of our basic needs from the plains. Food, fiber, fuel, and shelter are all at the top of that list.
It's no surprise that a lot of species that depend on grasslands aren't doing well, and that includes prairie grouse species.
Historically, we had 6 prairie grouse species in North America, and today 3 of them are either extinct or endangered, and the other 3 are declining.
That's Ted Cook. He's the executive director of the North American Grouse Partnership. And before he retired a few years back, he worked for 30 years as an endangered species biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Of the 6 prairie grouse species, heath hens in the east have been extinct for over a century. Atwater's prairie chickens on the Texas coast are functionally extinct in the wild. And then there's lesser prairie chickens that were just listed under the Endangered Species Act. And then the other 3 that aren't yet there but are getting closer are sage grouse, which a lot of folks have heard about, and then greater prairie chickens and sharp-tailed grouse, which can still be locally common, but have declined in range and in abundance from historical levels.
Prairie grouse, including lesser prairie chickens, need wide open spaces. And according to Grant Beaupre, a lesser prairie chicken biologist with New Mexico Game and Fish Department, habitat fragmentation to a chicken can be as subtle as a telephone pole.
A prairie chicken evolved with just really not even trees on the landscape. And so research has shown that prairie chickens exhibit avoidance behavior. So you stick a tower up in the middle of the prairie, even if it's shorter than a wind tower, say it's a telephone pole or line, they will avoid that by a certain distance and won't use the habitat surrounding it, whether that habitat is good or not. So predator may or may not be on that perch, but the chicken thinks it's a threat because the predator might be looking for them on that thing.
So a few structures that seem spaced out and unobtrusive to us may make an entire section of land uninhabitable for lesser prairie chickens.
And it's not just development and fragmentation that have impacted the bird. Poor land management, such as overgrazing and a century of fire suppression, have allowed for woody encroachment of plants like shinnery oak and mesquite to dominate huge sections of what was once a sea of grass.
There's some very good research that showing if you remove the mesquite, prairie chickens will move back in and use that habitat again. But they won't tolerate more than like one tree per acre.
So all of these changes, oil and gas development, cultivated agriculture, homes and roads, and poor land management have put the lesser prairie chicken in the crosshairs.
While historic estimates suggest the lesser prairie chicken numbered in hundreds of thousands or possibly even millions, surveys today indicate there are now around 30 to 40,000 birds.
If you imagine Native Americans and European settlers traveling across the southwestern Great Plains through this endless sea of grass, feeding themselves on lesser prairie chickens, they never could have imagined the day that all that would be left is postage stamps of prairies and an endangered species. But that's where we are.
So when it comes to lesser prairie chickens, we have an understanding of the problem and the many contributing causes. So what about the solutions? Where are lesser prairie chickens doing well? And how can we support more of that?
Honestly, we wouldn't have prairie chickens in this state in the numbers that we do today if we didn't have private landowners doing the conservation measures on their private property.
The only places they are left today are where these caring ranchers are stewarding the habitat and stewarding the landscape and stewarding these native prairies, keeping them there.
And native prairies are important for other reasons. Not only do they support wildlife such as lesser prairie chickens, but grasslands support human communities as well. And well-managed grasslands have the potential to sequester carbon. This has implications for not only our planet, but for the economics of land stewardship and conservation going forward.
And that's what's coming up next. After the break, we're exploring a collaborative conservation success story in the making.
We're in a new chapter of conservation. In the first chapter of conservation in this country, you had wilderness and then you had city. But today, more and more, we understand that there's this very important piece in the middle that we call the working landscape.
That is Leslie Allison, CEO of the Western Landowners Alliance.
These are the places that provide our food, our fiber. They provide the jobs that sustain the rural communities. These things are incredibly important and they're disappearing. And that's really our next challenge going forward. We have to think beyond protected wilderness. And you can't do that unless you're engaging the people in those landscapes, first and foremost in that solution.
Led by the people on the ground, Western Landowners Alliance advances policies and practices that sustain working lands, connected landscapes, and native species.
What we're seeing in the West today is incredibly hopeful because you do see collaborations, working with partners, trying to realize this vision that's so important to us. I think many places in the rural West are actually leading the way on this.
And so can you. Join us and learn more at westernlandowners.org.
In eastern New Mexico, a group of ranchers, nonprofits, state and federal agencies, all these partners are coming together to strengthen the connections of land stewardship, healthy soils, and supporting wildlife habitat.
Let's kick off by meeting one of the ranchers at the center of this collaborative initiative.
I'm Bryce Peterson. I'm a rancher in eastern New Mexico. I grew up in ranching. My ranching family comes from Colorado. Moved here in 1999 to the Mill and Sand area. My grandpa acquired a ranch there in the prairie-chicken habitat that we didn't even know was there. And I have since managed three ranches, and now Jamie and I, my wife, are on our own and have acquired our own property and doing our own ranch.
The Mill and Sand area is often called the lesser prairie chicken capital of New Mexico, the center of lesser prairie chicken habitat in the southern plains. Though Bryce and his family ranch south of Mill and Sand, they are well within chicken habitat, and the bird remains a key player in his family's ranching story today.
The lesser prairie chicken and the listings and things it has brought a lot of attention to our area, into the ranching community.
And with that attention, some much needed funding, including funding for this project we're learning about today, which includes 3 ranches, Working Lands Conservation, Western Landowners Alliance, as well as state and federal agencies. Jesse Jewin is a Western Landowners Alliance advisor and natural resource consultant. Before retirement, he was the director of the New Mexico Bureau of Land Management.
So we have worked on a grant that took a large landscape to look primarily at carbon in the soil and whether that carbon is affected through different management strategies, and could that be looked at on local ranches, but then also applied out to a much broader landscape.
And Megan Nasto explains further.
The idea of the project is to build a capacity for all of these groups to come together to develop better land management practices that can solve some of the critical issues of this region, of the Southern Great Plains. And one of the main issues I think that this region is facing is how to conserve habitat for the endangered lesser prairie chicken while still maintaining the economic livelihoods of ranchers and ranching communities in the neighborhood. And we kind of came at it somewhat surprisingly, not from a prairie chicken habitat perspective, but from the perspective of first understanding soil health and how grazing or the lack of grazing or the removal of invasive plants, how any of these land management strategies can be used to improve the health of the soils in these regions.
One indicator of healthy soils is carbon.
There are a number of reasons why soil carbon can be important. From a land stewardship perspective, more carbon in the soil typically means there's more water holding capacity, allowing for more resilience during dry times. So, more water equals more grass.
And from a global perspective, studies indicate that while forests sequester more carbon than grasslands, in an age of increased fire and drought, grasslands and rangelands could be a more resilient carbon sink because they store carbon underground.
And that brings a third angle to this equation: ecosystem service markets, paying someone like a rancher for ensuring that their land produces something we all need, like clean water or clean air, or as in this case, sequestered carbon. Basically, you find a way to measure these ecosystem services and generate credits that can be bought and sold in a marketplace.
Now, we're still in the early days of developing these markets, and it really feels like the Wild West out there. There are a lot of sales pitches, big promises being thrown around. Western Landowners Alliance is committed to ensuring ecosystem service markets are equitable for land stewards and actually reflect good stewardship on the ground.
If we get this right, ecosystem service markets have massive potential to incentivize and fund conservation and compensate land managers for benefits they already provide to society.
Take this project, which is looking specifically into carbon. It's funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which includes funding from food giants Burger King and Cargill, as part of their goal to reduce CO2 emissions and support stewardship on the plains.
All of these factors made this project interesting to ranchers like Bryce and Jamie Peterson when they chose to participate, looking at how their management practices influence carbon in the soil.
What piqued my interest to start this was the other markets. Ranching as a whole is a good business, but it takes other avenues and different sources to be viable in this business. But data collection is important, and without data, we don't really know what we have. I feel like those that ranch with just cows only, cows in mind, they're either very far ahead in the financial curve and they can focus purely on that, or they're probably falling behind. And those of us in the middle are probably looking at every avenue we possibly can to be viable and stay doing what we do for a living. I think I'm constantly looking outside of the cow to figure out what that viability would be.
So with this project, we're looking at how land management practices influence carbon in the soil. But how is this study actually conducted?
According to Chris Holvey and Megan Nasto at Working Lands Conservation, the first steps in co-producing research like this is always listening to the people on the ground.
One of the first things I think is always important to do in a project is figure out what everybody wants to learn. Monitoring is a term that's thrown around, and you can monitor so many things on a landscape. You can monitor how tall the grass is. You can monitor what kind of species are there. You can monitor all sorts of things. But if you don't really start by asking a question, you're going to just collect a lot of data. It's not going to tell you an answer.
So all these ranchers and partners got together to determine what questions they really needed answered.
Those included, how do grazing systems affect soil carbon? How does shrub removal affect soil carbon? So we really structured our sampling based on answering those questions.
And in this project, the ranchers are using adaptive management, and that includes applying intensive rotational grazing. But as Chris said, all of this listening is critical to designing a study in a way that provides practical knowledge for everyone involved.
So first you listen, then design the study, and then?
It was really just a lot of digging holes and collecting soil and putting them in bags. So then I could take back home to a lab to actually analyze for carbon. But the fun part of it is that, I spent weeks digging holes, which is something I love to do, but so many other people volunteered to help me. I mean, we had Jesse Jewin, who's a great partner in this project, former state BLM director from New Mexico, spending his retirement, spending 3-4 weeks out in the field with me every single day, digging holes, and he was just fantastic. We had folks from the agencies come out and help, and we even recruited 2 high school students from the Tatum High School in eastern New Mexico spend their entire spring break working with us and digging holes and collecting soil and just having a great time with us. So it was a fun time, but it involved really just getting to know that landscape and driving all over and sampling in one spot after another, after another, after another. It ended up being easily well over 1,000 samples that I had to load up into my truck and drive back to Utah, and then process and analyze. It was kilos of soil. It was a huge amount of soil. It was a lot of work.
So getting additional help to dig that many holes makes perfect sense. But there's another benefit. When you're getting a group of people who historically may not always see eye to eye, simply getting on the land together can help build that crucial ingredient to a successful collaborative. And that crucial ingredient is trust.
I found that there's kind of this magic in doing field science and getting a bunch of people together. Everybody starts interpreting what they're seeing together. And we as scientists might put one language on it, and the ranchers put another language on it, and the land managers put a different language on it. But that's how you start, all speaking the same language.
So Working Lands Conservation and partners and a couple of local teenagers dug a ton of holes and took kilos of soil back to the lab. What did they find?
We found that in areas where there is grazing, that there was more soil carbon, detectably more soil carbon than in areas that weren't grazed. Areas that were not grazed, the root systems were not as deep. In areas that were grazed, they were deeper. And the thing about plants is they act as little carbon pumps. They take carbon out of the atmosphere, they put it into their roots and their plant biomass, and then that carbon kind of leaks from the roots into the soil. And so they're these little pumps that bring carbon into the soil. So when you have those deeper roots, there's the potential of getting more carbon in deeper layers of the soil. And that's exactly what we found.
This finding, that well-managed grazing could increase soil carbon, that was no surprise to the ranchers.
We're dropping a lot of terms here today, including adaptive management and rotational grazing.
There are a lot of working definitions for adaptive management. It's basically the willingness to change management to meet changes in weather, climate, feed, water availability, markets, predator challenges, really anything. It's about staying flexible in your management in response to new information or changing conditions.
And in addition to strategies like woody brush removal and prescribed fire, ranchers in this project are grazing cattle as part of their adaptive management.
But not all grazing is created equal. Grazing is a tool, and if thoughtfully applied, can improve overall rangeland health. The ranchers involved in this study practice a form of rotational grazing, meaning that instead of letting cattle out across the entire range in the spring and rounding them up again in the fall, they intensively graze smaller pastures for a short period of time, followed by an extended period of rest.
Grazing in the appropriate intensity and duration for the landscape can lead to more forage availability above ground and deeper roots underground, meaning more carbon storage. And that's what this study found.
But remember, this project is trying to determine if this landscape can sequester enough carbon that it's worthwhile to participate in carbon markets, a potential tool that could support communities and their land stewardship. So what's the outcome there?
One thing that people are really excited right now about are carbon markets. So, is there enough carbon in those grazed areas that now we can get a profit off of that additional carbon? And in these landscapes, maybe not. It's a very small amount of carbon.
It's worth noting that this study found that rangelands that were adaptively managed by the ranchers had about double the amount of carbon in the soil compared to a nearby area of public land that had not been grazed in 15 years.
Ecologically, that's really important in our landscape, even that small amount of carbon, because these are really dry landscapes. And when carbon is in the soil, it actually binds water a little bit. So when the rains come in these areas, that carbon prevents that water from just seeping right through the soils, which are really sandy. And so there's more water for the growth of plants in those areas that are grazed. And so ecologically, those soils are healthier.
Okay, so this emerging collaborative group is studying how adaptive management practices can impact levels of soil carbon. But what does this have to do with the lesser prairie chicken?
Well, it really comes down to this.
Probably more than 60% or 70% of the chickens are on private land in the state of New Mexico.
Why are the birds on mostly private lands? Well, for one, the plains are largely privately owned, right? But also, how those lands are managed is providing habitat for the birds. And simply put, ranching and chickens rely on similar habitats, healthy grasslands.
If ranch operations and the people and communities they support can remain economically viable, they're less likely to be sold and developed.
So if we as a society can compensate land managers for providing essential ecosystem services like wildlife habitat or carbon, that stacking of enterprises can keep these ranches and their communities afloat.
After all, it's the people on the ground that are maintaining and improving habitat conditions that support lesser prairie chicken.
Now let's hear from Brett, another rancher involved in the project.
Brett Riley, we ranch here in southeast New Mexico and in western Oklahoma.
Brett is also now the Eastern New Mexico Resource Coordinator for the Western Landowners Alliance.
This ranch, primarily is cow-calf operation. Nestled here, we're in a checkerboard ranching area, private, state, and BLM lands. And then, we're also right in the middle of prairie chicken habitat. So, that's kind of a driver, always has been on this ranch. And probably, probably what got us into the conservation field to begin with.
We talked earlier about how the ranchers involved in this study are using an adaptive management approach to their operations. Brett helped us connect the dots between his management actions and the lesser prairie chicken.
And if we take care of the soils, they take care of the biomass, and if we can build healthy ecosystems, and then we're sequestering a little carbon along the way. We're helping our water infiltration by building up the organic matter in the soils with our grazing patterns. And then at the end of the day, we're building, healthy habitats for, in our instance, primarily the lesser prairie chicken, but in other areas, there's lots of other different kinds of wildlife.
Brett also tells us that he's involved with the Lesser Prairie Chicken Landowners Alliance, a group of about 25 landowners across New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Colorado, working with federal agencies to forge a path to chicken recovery.
Ted Cook and the Grouse Partnership helped get the alliance started.
I like to joke that I called up these landowner leaders in the different states in the southwestern Great Plains, and I said, hey, Ted Cook with the Grouse Partnership, and we want to save lesser prairie chickens and ranching. And they said, well, we disagree with you. We want to save ranching and lesser prairie chickens. And so obviously our interests were highly congruent.
And the vision for the Lesser Prairie Chicken Landowners Alliance? Defend the core of remaining chicken habitat across their range and expand it.
What we are trying to envision is, connecting these habitats and building, a pathway. And we talk about strongholds, right? What we're looking at doing here is building a over 110,000 acre stronghold right here in this part of the world, and trying to put some things in place and, kind of use it as a model as, how do we do this? What percentage shinnery do we need? What percentage tall grass do we need? How much open ground do we need? I mean, these are all questions that we need to ask that probably haven't been looked at close enough. And I don't really think we've studied the ecology of the soils and the ecology of the ecosystem enough. And we studied the bird, but I'm not sure we've studied their home enough. And so what we're trying to do is put it together so we can connect all these pathways to go all the way from here up into west central Kansas, which is the northern range of the lessers, and try and build it so that we can put that back together as it was years ago. And I mean, reality is such that we know we'll never be able to make it like it used to be, but I think with a little help and a little bit of collaboration, we can get it to the point to where we can have enough birds that they can have a thriving population and be successful again.
And according to Brett's philosophy, what's good for the rancher's good for the bird. And participating in studies such as this one helps him understand how his management actions are impacting the landscape.
We kind of look at it as a holistic approach. If what works for our chicken and not just the chicken but the other wildlife species that are on the ranch also work for our cow habitat. I mean, we've just got some research data in that showed that parts of the ranch were like 35% less bare ground than we were 10 years ago.
But what about this project in particular? We asked Brett his thoughts about the results of this landscape-level carbon study.
Certainly, this project's been very useful and been very informative. Do I feel like carbon's ever going to be a leader for us? I don't. I don't feel like out here in these arid environments that we're ever going to sequester enough carbon to actually make the carbon sequestration portion of it pay. But what I do think is more important than that is the fact that the adaptive grazing and management systems that you can utilize that will sequester the carbon are far more valuable than the carbon itself that you're putting in the ground. The practice maybe is more important than the end result.
As we mentioned earlier, improving soil health through adaptive management can lead to outcomes like more water in the soil and an increase in forage availability, which can help ranching operations be resilient to challenges like drought.
And while Brett doesn't think carbon credits could be worthwhile in eastern New Mexico, some sort of habitat lease or biodiversity credit could go a long way to support ranching communities who are actively stewarding our remaining grasslands.
When we start talking about biodiversity and wildlife, and I think maybe that's a new frontier that we're just kind of getting in on right now. And I think it's one that probably, especially in our part of the world, is going to be probably more significant.
In addition to ecosystem service markets, Brett thinks modifying existing federal Farm Bill programs could also support lesser prairie chicken conservation on working lands. That's one avenue the Lesser Prairie Chicken Landowner Alliance is working on right now.
But in any case, there needs to be a toolbox of financial support for ranchers and communities who are proactively building and maintaining critical wildlife habitat especially when we consider how little intact grasslands are left.
We squeeze the margins on all these producers to the point to where, you have to be bigger and bigger and bigger. And then we've gotten to the point to where there's just not many cents left over when you get done at the end of the day. And so I think if we're going to ask these folks to go in there and maybe improve the ecology on certain portions of this landscape and build these habitats, there has to be an offset somewhere there to provide them with the monetary stability. We would welcome any kind of collaboration. We just want what's best for the ecosystem. We're here. This is where we live. This is how we make a living.
It's clear from visiting with the ranchers involved in this project that when it comes to staying in business and supporting wildlife, they're committed for the long haul.
And that's a good thing. After all, it's thoughtful ranchers like Brett and Bryce and their families and a collaboration of partners who are pushing against the decline of habitat that's slowly eating away at the plains.
I think if we would, open our eyes as a society and look at, who's going to be the one that's going to lead this, ecological revolution, you might say, it's going to be the producer.
So if we want resilient ecosystems, we need to support the people on the ground stewarding them.
I was on a Zoom call a while back with some folks from the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they said, we cannot mandate or dictate our way into saving the chicken. If we don't have the producers on our side working with us, the species is going to go extinct. And they're probably right. I mean, not probably right. I know they're right because producers are the ones with the boots on the ground out here. We're the ones that see it every day. We know what's going on. I feel confident we can build a habitat out here. We've done it. We know how to do it. I mean, we've done it enough now and know the grazing, utilizing cattle as another tool, right, in that toolbox to build that habitat. But what I don't know when the chickens are going to come back or where they're going to come back or what they're going to do, because I can't dictate what a chicken's going to do. But I can build them a home, and I can build a habitat, and I can make it, desirable for them to be there. And I have a pretty good feeling if we do that, they'll expand again and come out.
At the end of the day, the collective vision emerging from the plains is a biome-level model for conservation. And while the lesser prairie chicken may have been the trigger, it's not just about the bird.
Where do we have these remaining intact systems? How do we protect them? And how do we expand the central core and support what is working? This is a model of thinking that can be applied to conservation challenges anywhere. And it requires leadership from the land and people working across boundaries to make it happen.
And it's the continuous, thoughtful stewardship by communities on the ground that is supporting the lesser prairie chicken. It's not setting aside land and simply letting it be. So how can we do a better job supporting those people and their contributions? Whether it's a private market solution, a public funding solution, or a toolbox of both. As a society, we need to better support what we truly value.
And so while the future of lesser prairie chickens remain uncertain and the challenges we face are complex, if we work together, we can chart a path forward that supports people, wildlife, and the spaces we share, the critical piece we call the working wild.
Let's sit down at the table, everybody. I'd even invite the environmental groups that don't like cows. Come talk to us. Let's sit down at the table and visit about it, and let's go out in the country and look at it, and let's fix this problem. I mean, it's not anything that's insurmountable. We can do it. It's just a matter of rolling your sleeves up and getting it done.
Working Wild U is a production of Montana State University Extension and Western Landowners Alliance, with support from the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, and you, our listeners. This episode was written and produced by me, Zach Altman, with support from our hosts, Jared Beaver and Hallie Mahal. Lewis Wirtz and Jared Beaver are our executive producers. Music is from Artlist and Blue Dot Sessions. Special thanks to Bryce and Jamie Peterson, Brett Riley, Jesse Jewin, Chris Hulvey, Megan Nasto, Grant Beaupre, Ted Cook, Hannah Weaver, the Bureau of Land Management, New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, New Mexico State Lands Office, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. And as always, please be sure to follow us on social media and head to our website to check out show notes and bonus content. That's at workingwild.us. And please help more people discover the show by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, and share this episode with a friend or neighbor. That's all for now. We'll see you next time on Working Wild U.